Okay, so before I talk about anything else, I just want to have it on the record that I called that Wit was Hoid basically from the first scene where Wit appeared, and I'm pretty happy about that. I'm pretty proud of that, that I managed to guess that. So I'll talk about Hoid more later. I just wanted to immediately sort of you know, just say how proud of myself I am. Completely. Completely disproportionately to how much I probably should be. Um, anyway, let's talk about this section because this is definitely the most eventful section of the book so far. This felt like a climax. I don't know if the fifth part of the book will also continue to be a climax and be an even bigger climax, or if it will be more of an epilogue, because there's not much book left. Like, the fifth part of the book appears to be pretty short. So maybe this was the entire climax of this book, and all that's left is an epilogue, which would be fine. This was a pretty good climax for Kaladin and Dalinar. I'm still expecting some kind of more definitive ending for Shallan. But this was actually fantastic. I loved so much about this. I do have some criticisms that I'll get. Well, not necessarily criticisms, more concerns, I guess, that I'll get to towards the end. But overall, this was fantastic. Really, there's I guess three main thrusts I want to talk about here. One is sort of Dalinar's development. The other is Kaladin, and the third is sort of the mystical, magical plot with Hoid and Dalinar's visions and all that, which all feels like its own self-contained thread, despite having a lot to do with both Dalinar and Kaladin. It feels like it's not necessarily. It feels like it's more tied to the overarching story than to their individual arcs in this book. So I'll talk about that separately. And I think I'll talk about that at the end, because that feels like it's going to be more important going forward in the series. So, let's talk about our main characters here. First of all, we have Kaladin. Kaladin is, at this point, probably the best developed character that Sanderson has written. Dalinar's pretty good too, but Kaladin is leagues ahead of him, presumably because this was his development book, like he got all the flashbacks and stuff. So, Kaladin is such a believable and realistic human being in a way that no other I don't. It sounds insulting to Sanderson's other characters. Sanderson writes characters pretty good, but they tend to be relatively two-dimensional. Like, there's interesting stuff with the main characters of Mistborn, for example. Vin and Elend both have some interesting stuff going on, but essentially they can be boiled down to a handful of character traits and motivations, and that's fine for a story that isn't super character driven, which Mistborn wasn't. Mistborn was primarily a plot driven story. But and I was kind of concerned going into Stormlight because I knew it was very character driven, and Sanderson hadn't really written any characters so far that felt like they would be able to carry a fully character driven story all on their own. But he's definitely done it this time. Shallan, Dalinar, and Kaladin are all leagues ahead of other Sanderson characters in terms of feeling like real people, having some idiosyncrasies, some contradictions in their characterization, not being able to be easily summed up. You can't always predict what these people are going to do because they aren't defined by like a handful of clear-cut traits and motivations. They're complicated like real people are. And so while you can't predict what they're going to do a lot of the time, once they do it, it retroactively makes a lot of sense. So I just want to sort of congratulate Sanderson on these three characters. Hopefully going forward, more characters will get that treatment. I mean, I'm sure they will, because from what I know, each book of the Stormlight Archive is supposed to focus on a different character, and there's 10 books planned, so eventually there's going to be at least 10 characters that should be developed to the degree that Kaladin is now. At least. At least that's the hope. We'll see if that level of quality of characterization carries on into the future books. So that's my first point. Characterization masterful for these three characters. I'm not including Adolin because I still don't think Adolin counts as a main character. Like he's one of the primary point of view characters of this book, but he's just so bland and uninteresting to me. I still feel like Adolin is really only there to provide an external point of view to some of Dalinar's story, at least for now. But we'll see if that changes in future books, or maybe even in part 5 of this book, who knows. So let's talk about the major event here at the ending. Before I get to that, I just want to say that there was a thread through this section, and in part through the previous section, of Dalinar being characterized in a very interesting way whenever he was interacting with Sadeas, especially whenever the issue of the Bridgeman came up. And I was curious if Sanderson was doing this on purpose, if he was aware of what he was doing, or if he wasn't. Because Sanderson does sometimes have a bit of a blind spot when it comes to sort of like condemning certain unjust power relations between classes and castes in society. There were some issues in the third Mistborn book where some characters were maybe presented in a more positive light than I think they should have been. So I was slightly concerned at parts during this section that Dalinar was being used to essentially show us that Sadeas is actually a pretty good guy, and that the whole Bridgeman thing is like, yeah, he probably shouldn't be doing it, but it's not that bad. Like, he's a decent guy. No, that's not what Sanderson was doing. And I about halfway through this section, I was 100% sure that that's not what Sanderson was doing. Even before Sadeas' betrayal here, it became really obvious because of how Dalinar and Sadeas' interactions were written whenever whenever they were talking about the Bridgemen and the bridges and the tactics around that and whose approach is better. So one thing that was fairly consistent here was that Dalinar finds the Sadeas' practices with the Bridgemen barbaric and horrible, but he himself isn't necessarily willing to condemn Sadeas for it. Dalinar's attitude is very much, oh, I personally would never do something this horrible, but I'm not gonna judge Sadeas for doing it. Like, that's just my problem. Which ends up biting him in the ass, because if he'd actually maybe paid more attention to how Sadeas treats people around him, he could have maybe predicted that Sadeas would do what he did at the end of this section and betray him. But I think that's a very interesting actually choice on Brandon's part, because I think that's very realistic. What we essentially have here is Dalinar showing class solidarity with Sadeas. Dalinar is so used to the hideous systemic injustices of the system that has served him very well. He's a high prince. Like, from his perspective, the system, like, he has issues with it, but personally, he's gotten off pretty good. So, he doesn't necessarily view the system as fundamentally broken to the core and unjust to the core because, well, it's like I said, it's working out pretty well for him. So he can't see how certain basic foundational things about the system, he can't see how bad they are. Like, he can see they're bad. He condemns the whole bridge thing. Like, he doesn't like it. He sees it as wrong. But he sees it like it's wrong. He sees it as wrong as like, oh, he's not following the codes. Like, it's the same kind of wrong as being rude at dinner, not wearing your uniform all the time, slaughtering hundreds of innocent slaves. See, he sort of treats these as equally wrong, basically. And so, like, he judges Thaddeus basically equally for not following the codes about various petty minor things and for sending hundreds of innocent men to their deaths. And I think that's going to change going forward. I think this was a bit of a wake-up call to Dalinar, hopefully, and that Dalinar might now realize that there are some deeper issues with the way this society is structured than just people not following the codes. And we see that at the end here. Like, he is clearly planning to do some very thorough reforms of this society. I'm not super happy about how he's going about it, because he seems to have a very paternalistic approach. He's like, oh, our society needs a strong hand to guide it. They're like children. They need to be forced to behave, and then they shall be free. That's like a not loving that mindset necessarily. Makes me a bit uncomfortable, but it's something Sanderson is prone to. Sanderson, like, Mistborn had a lot of, hard times call for hard men rhetoric in it around Elend. Which wasn't necessarily always meant to be seen as a good thing. A comment I got on a recent video actually pointed this out. Shout out to that comment. This was on, I believe, on the final Hero of Ages video. I got a comment that, among other things, basically pointed out that Elend is kind of an unreliable narrator in that book, and that we aren't necessarily supposed to take all of the things that he does as the book endorsing those things, which is a good point. Like, if you're reading critically, you need to look out for that. But I do think that Sanderson does tend to, and I think that comment actually agreed with this part. I do think that Sanderson has a slight tendency to sort of have this idea of like the strong authoritarian but good leader who's going to make things better. Like a lot of his stories have this idea, I think, that an authoritarian top-down power structure is ultimately the right way to go, so long as the right people are on top. Which I personally disagree with, but it's fine. It's how a lot of fantasy works, so it's not like it's a problem unique to Sanderson. In fact, not doing it that way would be more of an outlier than doing it that way in a fantasy book. So it's not something that bothers me necessarily. It's just something I notice and that kind of like sticks in the back of my head. Is like, oh, I'd do that differently if I were writing this. But anyway, that's enough about Dalinar's specifically, I want to, well, not necessarily, there's more Dalinar to come, but I want to talk about the climax as a whole. So, Kaladin's uh, life-changing decision to give up on his plans of escape in order to help innocent people. It's notable that he doesn't stay behind just to help Dalinar and Adolin. He's still not super trusting of Light Eyes, or doesn't particularly care about them. He stays behind to help the thousands of innocent men who are trapped on the plateau. And this is an interesting moment because from the second that it became clear that Sadeas was abandoning Dalinar to die, I basically knew exactly what was going to happen. I mean, I didn't know the details, but from that moment I saw the next couple of chapters laid out before me. I knew immediately that Kaladin and his bridge crew would stay behind, they would end up saving Dalinar, and as a result, Dalinar would end up taking them into his army and therefore saving them from Sadeas. Like, that was immediately clear to me. And I feel like this is a great example of a story being good because it's predictable. Like, there are some stories, and Mistborn is one of these, and a lot in this book has also fallen into this category, where it's the surprise that makes the story good. Like, I love being surprised by stories. I love when stories don't go where I expect them to. But sometimes, what you need is a story that is so carefully plotted and so carefully laid out, and everything that happens is so clearly building upon what happens before, that someone who pays attention can tell where the story is going and still be incredibly satisfied to see it get there. And this was an example of that. Like, the writing here is some of Sanderson's best. This whole section of Kaladin saving Dalinar, or rather, Bridge 4 saving the Kholin army, because it's not just Kaladin and Dalinar here, it's other people as well. This whole section was written masterfully, and even though I knew most of the major events that were going to happen, just because they were obvious to me from a certain point, that didn't even slightly reduce my enjoyment while watching them actually unfold. So that was fantastic. Kaladin in particular, the way that all the various flashbacks and things we know about Kaladin's life and Tien's death and his experiences with Bridge 4, the way that was all brought together and called back to in that final moment to inspire him was fantastic. The reveal that Syl is Honor Spren is interesting. We'll get to that later because that's part of the overarching plot part that I want to talk about. And the final thing I want to talk about this big climax here is Dalinar giving up his shard blade. I did not see that one coming, and honestly, Dalinar has won me over. Like, I was kind of like, throughout this book, like, I really enjoy reading about Dalinar, but I didn't really like him as a person because I couldn't overlook the massive cruelties and injustices that he was complicit in just by being a high prince in this society, and that he was willing to tolerate from his peers without even really, like, criticizing them. I couldn't overlook the fact that, like, he could probably do something to fix the situation for all the slaves dying, but he just didn't because it just wasn't very important to him. It just wasn't on his radar. But this is a pretty compelling, like, grand gesture, like, as far as proving that you're ultimately a decent person. So I was not expecting it. I was expecting him to maybe fight Sadeas, just like Sadeas was. But, like, I audibly gasped when I realized what he was doing with the shard blade. That was pretty cool. I have like a weird feeling where I simultaneously hope that Dalinar continues to live up to Kaladin's hopes and continues to be a good person all the way through and protect Kaladin and Bridge 4 because I want good things for Kaladin. Like, I love Kaladin and I want good things to happen to him. He deserves it. He's a good boy and he's suffered enough. But on the other hand, I also kind of want Dalinar to let Kaladin down eventually, because I feel like that would make for a more interesting and compelling story, and I feel like Kaladin should keep his distrust of Light Eyes in general, because I feel like, generally speaking, even if that's not necessarily applicable to Dalinar, that is a good attitude to have in this world. Like, I don't think he's gonna meet many or any non-colon decent Light Eyes, frankly. Decent Alethi Light Eyes. There's also Shallan. Shallan seems okay. Like, from what we can tell so far, Ja Keved isn't quite as brutal of a slave society thing as Alethkar. I don't think we have any confirmation that Ja Keved actually has slaves. I know Kharbranth doesn't. We haven't spent enough time in Ja Keved itself to actually know that, I guess. So I'll withhold judgment on Ja Keved. So far, Kharbranth seems the best of the Vorin cultures, definitely, though. Okay, I've talked a lot about Kaladin and Dalinar. Now let's talk about Hoid and the actual, like, mega plot, the overarching plot. So, boy, still have no idea what's actually going on, but we do have some hints. So, Hoid is clearly, like, I think we can safely say at this point that Hoid is maybe not like a good guy, but he's not a villain. Like, he's not the he's not gonna turn out to be the bad guy. He's trying to do something that he believes is going to be good. Like, he's trying to do something positive, I think. That could be a misdirection, but I don't think so. Like, my vibe from Hoid so far is that he's like, he's I don't, maybe trying to save the world, maybe, or rather the Cosmere. Like, I feel like he might be trying to save the Cosmere from some kind of grand threat, but he might also be going about it in a way that is going to turn out to be harmful. I don't know, it's so hard to tell because there's some weird vibes there. So, Hoid says here that Hoid is not his actual name. Hoid is the name of someone he should have loved. I don't know what to make of that. I'm just making a note of it because it's probably going to be important. The entire Kaladin and Hoid scene, by the way, is great. Like, it's one of my favorite chapters. But probably related to Hoid and his storyline, the weird symbol head things that Shallan can see, Elhokar apparently also sees them. It's mentioned at one point that Elhokar sees them in mirrors. He doesn't see them in real life, but he sees them in mirrors, just like Shallan sees them in her drawings. So it's not a uniquely Shallan thing, but it's also not everyone, because obviously people look in mirrors all the time. So it's not like they're visible in mirrors in general, I guess. It's just that certain people can see them in certain situations. I'm guessing those guys are probably some kind of like major antagonistic force for the series. We still don't know that. Right. Honor Spren. That's the thing I wanted to talk about. So, when Dalinar goes to the past for his final vision, and he meets the guy who wrote The Way of Kings, I can't remember, the in-universe book. He doesn't meet Brandon Sanderson. He meets the guy in-universe who wrote the in-universe book, Way of Kings. And that guy says, Alakavish was a surge binder. He should have known better. And yet, the Nahel bond gave him no more wisdom than an ordinary man. Alas, not all spren are as discerning as honor spren. So, apparently there's other kinds of spren besides Syl, the kind that she is, which is honor spren. There's other kinds of spren that can forge a bond with a human and give them powers. And apparently having that is called being a surge binder. I'm trying to remember if we knew that. Was that what Seth called his powers in the intro? I'll have to go back and look at that, actually. But apparently these kinds of spren used to be way more common, and the society that existed before, when, like, back in the time when The Way of Kings was written, that society had a lot of surge binders and a lot of people who had bonds with spren. And apparently the Parshendi have some knowledge of that as well, because they react very specifically to Kaladin revealing his surge binder status. Like, they immediately, like, they call him something. I don't think I took note of what they called him, actually. And they start chanting a special song, and some of them retreat, and they, like, treat him as, like, a special person, I guess. So, like, the Parshendi know more about what's going on than the humans do. And maybe that's the reason why Gavilar wanted a treaty with them. Maybe Gavilar figured out that the Parshendi know stuff about the old times that humans have forgotten, and he wanted access to that knowledge. That's just my working theory right now. So yeah, what else can I say? Oh, right, one final thing I really liked about this section. So the little blurbs at the beginning of each chapter, which are like quotes from people right before they die, and like clearly these people are seeing some kind of divine or satanic vision. Like, who knows who's sending those visions, but they're seeing some kind of vision. And what I like is that we are starting to get fake ones. Like, we are starting to get ones that clearly aren't that. Like, they're clearly not the genuine article. They're clearly just someone's otherwise, like, regular last words. But because of the things they said, they're still jotted down as potentially significant. So there's one person who's clearly read The Way of Kings and who just makes a reference to the Oath of the Knights Radiant as their final words. From a scholar, like it's specifically a scholar of some renown, who says, "Death is my life, strength becomes my weakness, my journey has ended." And that's clearly not a vision that person is receiving. That's clearly that person paraphrasing or quoting from The Way of Kings. Which is cool, that you can put that together. And the other one that's interesting is I wish to sleep. I know now why you do what you do, and I hate you for it. I will not speak of the truths I see. So clearly there's someone who did get a vision, but refuses to speak it out loud, because he hates the people who are trying to collect these visions from him. I'm guessing that means that at least some of these people were actually killed by the people collecting the visions, like, as part of this experiment. So, we still don't know who's actually doing that. It might actually be Jasna? Maybe? We'll see. So yeah, that was just sort of a minor thing I wanted to note that I think is really cool. Like, that little detail of those clearly fake quotes, like the ones that just aren't the real article. Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to talk about is the Parshendi. I think that we are getting more and more. We're clearly building up towards the reveal about the Parshendi and sort of them becoming actual characters. I don't know what it is, but I just wanted to note that I have noticed that we are getting, that it's pretty clear at this point that the Parshendi are not the bad guys of this story, and arguably the Alethi are. So whatever is going on with the Parshendi, I hope we get to see that in the final part of this book. I hope I don't have to wait until the next book for that, but maybe I will. Um, yeah. Oh, one final note actually. This quote from Kaladin's perspective about the fact that Dalinar is like using Sadeas's bridgemen, but only like the bridges that have been set ahead of time for Sadeas or something. Perhaps attacking this way served to protect Dalinar's pristine image. He wouldn't make bridgemen die, not directly at least. Never mind that he stood on the backs of the men who had fallen to get Sadeas across. Their corpses were his true bridge. So I like this line because it's true, but it's also not true. Like it's a perfect misunderstanding of Dalinar essentially. Like because the basic premise here is true. It's true that Dalinar is really failing to be a decent person here. Like he is failing in his moral duty by essentially using Sadeas's inhumane, cruel methods, but in a way that like washes his hands of them. So it's like, oh, Sadeas did it, and then I'm just taking advantage of the bridges once they're already there. So that is true, but what's not true is the part about it being to protect his image. Dalinar doesn't care how people see him, and Kaladin has no way of knowing that. What Dalinar is actually protecting is his image of himself, so his self-image. He's not trying to look good in the eyes of others, he's trying to look good in his own eyes. And that doesn't make it better that he's doing that, it still makes him a hypocrite. But it's interesting how Kaladin gets so close to actually reading Dalinar correctly here, I think, but doesn't quite hit the mark because he doesn't know him, and he just assumes that Dalinar is like every other Light Eyes, when he's actually different in meaningful ways that don't necessarily make him innocent of the crimes done by the Light Eyes as a whole, but that do distinguish him. So yeah, that's everything. This was over half an hour, Jesus Christ. I went a bit overboard with these, but I had a lot of thoughts here. My throat is so dry. I'm going to go eat something, and then I'm going to keep reading actually, because I really want to finish this book, and I'm so close. So I'll probably record part 5 in like a day or two. See you.